The dust on County Road 7 was the color of dried tobacco, fine and heavy, and it stuck to everything. The cedar fence posts, the sagging porch screen, and the lungs of Jed Stone. Jed was 42, though the sickness had etched 50 years into his face, leaving him mostly bone and shadow in the big, iron-frame bed. He knew his time was near. The doctor, a kind but plain-spoken man named Doc Eli, had said as much with a long sigh and a look that held more pity than medicine. All Jed wanted before he went to meet the Lord was a patch of peace, maybe just a sweet memory to carry with him. It was a cruel kind of summer, the air thick as gravy and the cicadas screaming louder than a revival preacher. His cousin, May, who'd been helping, was worn down to a frazzle and finally admitted she needed help. That's when Clara Bell showed up. Clara, a nurse from 3 counties over, drove up in a blue Ford that looked as tired as she did. The moment she stepped onto the porch, the cicadas seemed to hush just a little, and a shadow, cool and strange, fell over the porch swing. She had eyes the color of creek water after a rain, clear but deep, and a guarded way about her, like a bird that expects a stone to be thrown. Jed felt something shift inside his chest, and it wasn't just the pain. It was the sudden, sharp, lovely sting of wanting something he couldn't have, not even for a minute. Clara had that nurse's quiet step, the kind that whispers across a hardwood floor without disturbing a soul. She was professional, starched, and proper, but under all that practical white cotton, Jed could see the trembling soul. She tended to him with a gentle care that felt almost sacramental, changing linens, cooling his fevered brow with a damp cloth, and measuring out his bitter medicines. But she never stayed close for long, never leaned in too near, and never ever let her hand rest on his skin for more than a necessary second. It was the distance she kept that snagged at Jed's heart, more than the pain of his own body. He knew folks talked about her, whispered things about her past in the grocery aisle and over the fence line. They said Clara Bell was marked, that misfortune trailed her like a hound dog, and that anyone she came to truly care for was sure to meet an untimely end. Jed, bless his fading life, didn't care about the gossip. He was already standing at the edge of the grave. What was a little bad luck to a dying man? He only saw the weary kindness in her eyes and the way her lower lip would quiver when she thought he wasn't looking. He started to watch for that quiver, a small sign that the iron wall she built around herself might just have a crack in it. He wanted to know the story behind her fear. The curse, Clara told herself every morning as she ironed her uniform, was not a superstition. It was history. It started when she was a girl, just 17, and her mama's prized garden was struck by lightning on the day her daddy left for good. Then, the boy she loved in high school, sweet Tommy Ray, took a nasty fall from the water tower the week after he kissed her under the old oak tree. The list wasn't long, but it was devastatingly final. Every deep connection, every heartfelt joy, was swiftly followed by ruin or loss. She'd learned to live like a ghost, serving others but never allowing herself to need them. Coming to Jed Stone's dusty old place was a job, a penance almost, because he was already on his way out. No harm could be done to a man already claimed, she reasoned. But Jed, with his pale skin and eyes full of sharp, stubborn life, was defying the math of his body. He'd grin at her, a slow, tired tilt of his lips, and ask her simple things, like what her favorite color was, blue, the shade of robin's eggs, or what she dreamed of, a small, quiet cabin far away from all roads. With every passing day, he was pulling her across that chasm she had carved out for herself. She found herself rearranging his flowers, spending an extra minute straightening his blanket, dreading the moment the job would end, dreading the moment he would end. One sweltering afternoon, the heat pressed down so hard the air felt like a woolen shroud. Jed was having a bad spell, his breathing shallow and quick, rattling like dry leaves. Clara moved swiftly, her nurse training taking over, administering oxygen, adjusting his pillows, working with a focus that pushed the curse right out of her mind. When the crisis passed and Jed finally settled back, sweat shining on his brow, he looked up at her, really looked at her, and his voice was a mere scrape of sound. "You," he whispered. "You fight like an angel, Clara Bell." His compliment, raw and honest, broke through her defenses faster than a fever. She sat on the edge of the bed, her practiced distance forgotten, and took his thin, cool hand in both of hers. She felt the delicate architecture of his bones, the fragility of the life thrumming beneath, and a terrifying wave of love, pure, fierce, and utterly forbidden, washed over her. The room suddenly seemed darker, the air heavier. "This is it," a cold voice whispered in her heart. "I sealed his fate." A shard of fear, sharp as broken glass, made her snatch her hands back, leaving Jed's on the white sheet, a solitary white flag against the shadow of his illness. The days started to blur into a single humid tapestry of near death and whispered life. Jed started sharing his memories, stories of growing up poor but happy, fishing in the creek, and the one true regret he carried: never telling the girl at the county fair that he loved her before she moved away. He didn't tell these stories to mourn his life, but to give it away, piece by piece, to the one person who truly listened. Clara, in turn, began to crack open her own painful vault. She told him about Tommy Ray, not the silly boy who fell, but the sweet way he used to bring her wild clover flowers. She didn't use the word curse, but she spoke of the pattern, the cold, undeniable sequence of joy followed by destruction. "It's not bad luck, Jed," she said one evening, the oil lamp casting deep shadows on the wall. "It's a shadow, waiting for me to settle down, waiting for me to be happy, and then it snatches the light away." Jed listened, his breath catching sometimes, but he never flinched. He simply held her gaze. "Sugar," he said, using the first affectionate term he dared. "That shadow ain't got the strength to fight a man already looking it in the face." His acceptance of his own mortality wasn't grim. It was liberating, and that liberation was catching. Jed's condition was a constant, terrifying roller coaster. One morning he'd eat a full plate of eggs and laugh at a joke. The next, he'd drift away, unreachable. Clara was living on pure adrenaline and fear. She found herself negotiating with the curse, making silent promises. "If you let him have this one good day, I'll never touch him again. If he makes it through the night, I'll take a different job next week." But the promises were paper thin, crumbling whenever Jed's eyes met hers. She saw her fear wasn't protecting him. It was stealing the precious little time they had left. The conflict raged inside her. The nurse's duty to provide comfort versus the haunted woman's instinct to retreat and preserve. One morning, the power went out. A quick summer storm had rolled up the creek and knocked a transformer. The house went dark and silent, save for the rain drumming on the tin roof. Jed started coughing, hard, wrenching coughs that terrified Clara. She fumbled in the dark for the lantern, panic rising like the floodwaters. In that black moment, she didn't just grab his hand for a pulse. She grabbed it to anchor herself, holding onto his fragile life force as if it were her own. When the lantern finally flared to life, casting a golden halo around the bed, they were still holding hands. The storm outside seemed far away, and the moment stretched, suspended between the danger and the dark. Jed squeezed her fingers, a surprisingly firm pressure. "You all right, Clara?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. She swallowed, her throat tight with a dozen unsaid things. "I'm the one supposed to be asking you that," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe," Jed said, his gaze fixed on their joined hands, pale against the white sheet. "But I think you're the one who's been fighting the hardest. You fight that shadow like it's right here in the room. But look at me, Clara. I'm here, and I ain't going nowhere until my time is up. Let it come, sugar. Let it come if it must. But don't waste today running from yesterday's ghost." His words weren't a challenge. They were an invitation to cease fire. For the first time in her adult life, Clara didn't feel the need to flee. She sat there, through the rest of the storm, their hands linked, letting the peace of his acceptance quiet the frantic drum of her own heart. The silence became a shelter. The next few days were marked by a shift, a quiet, undeniable surrender to the sweetness of the moment. Clara started bringing her meals into Jed's room, not just eating quickly at the kitchen counter, but sitting in the old wooden rocker, sharing the silence. She'd read him poems from a tattered book he kept under his pillow, her voice low and melodic. One afternoon, he asked her to cut his hair. It was a simple, intimate act, standing over him, the electric clippers buzzing softly, the scent of his skin and the dusty cologne he insisted on wearing filling her senses. As she brushed the clippings from his forehead, their eyes met in the reflection of the mirror he held up, and the look was so full of longing it nearly buckled her knees. It wasn't pity. It was reciprocal, deep, desperate affection. The fear of the curse was still there, a thin, icy braid around her throat, but the warmth of Jed's presence, the sheer wonder of his unexpected love, was melting the edges of the ice. She realized her curse wasn't in causing death. It was in allowing the fear of death to prevent her from living. She was wasting her only life waiting for a tragedy that was already guaranteed for Jed. The town, naturally, noticed. Jed's cousin, May, came by one Tuesday with a casserole and a pinched expression. She saw Clara sitting by the bed, openly reading aloud, her hand resting lightly on Jed's foot beneath the blanket. May didn't say anything to Clara, but she pulled Jed aside when Clara stepped out to draw bath water. "Jedediah," May hissed, her voice low and sharp. "That woman's got a name in 3 counties, and it ain't a good one. She's a death knell, son. You're already sick. Don't go welcoming that kind of black magic into your final days. You need comfort, not temptation." Jed looked at his cousin, the kind woman who had done her best, and shook his head slowly. "May," he whispered, "I'm already in the boat, looking at the shore. Clara ain't a death knell. She's a harbor. She makes the coming quiet easier. And Lord knows, I ain't been this tempted by life since I was 21. Don't worry about my soul, May. Worry about the time I got left." May left, the lid of the casserole dish rattling with her indignation. But her warning only cemented Jed's resolve. He didn't have time for propriety. He only had time for truth, and the truth was, he loved the woman with the cursed past. The external conflicts started to rise like the creek after a flash flood. Jed's coughing fits grew longer and more violent, shaking his frail body. One dawn, Clara woke to find him struggling, his eyes wide with a fear she hadn't seen before, a primal, raw panic. It wasn't the fear of dying itself, but of dying alone, before he could finish what they had started. She called Doc Eli, who came quickly, his face grim as he examined Jed. "He's fading fast, Clara," the doctor murmured outside the room. "I don't know what you're doing for him, but keep it up. The will to live is what's keeping him from slipping entirely." Doc Eli didn't know about the curse or the love, but he saw the fight in Jed's eyes, a fire that shouldn't have been there. When the doctor left, Clara walked back into the room, her decision made. She sat on the bed next to Jed, pulled him gently into her arms, resting his head on her shoulder. The contact was electric, terrifying, and profoundly right. If the curse wants him, she thought, rocking him gently, it will have to take him from my arms. This quiet, desperate embrace became their new normal. Jed, weak as he was, would find strength just to hold her hand or rest his head against her chest. They talked about forever, not in the way healthy people do, but in the way 2 souls facing separation talk about the eternal echo. "You'll carry me with you, Clara Bell?" Jed murmured one afternoon, stroking her cheek with his thumb. "Every time you smell honeysuckle or hear a cricket in the dark, that'll be me. I'll be your little ghost, but a happy one." Clara would cry then, quiet, hot tears that fell onto his pajamas. "Don't talk like that," she'd plead, but she knew it was the honest truth. She was trying to build enough good memory to last her the rest of her solitary life. They were weaving a story together, a brief, beautiful tale of love found at the very end of the road. Their relationship was a quiet defiance, a middle finger raised to fate, declaring that even a minute of genuine connection was worth a lifetime of fear and regret. They were racing the clock, not for a cure, but for a memory. But the curse, or simply the inevitability of his illness, wasn't going to let them off easy. One night, Jed awoke with a wrenching scream, his body convulsing, his skin clammy and cold. It was the worst turn yet. Clara was instantly there, calling the ambulance, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. As she held him down, trying to keep him from hurting himself, her mind screamed one word: curse, curse, curse. The shadow was real. It had found her happiness and was trying to snatch it away in the cruelest manner possible. The paramedics rushed in, their faces tight with concern, their professional calm a jarring contrast to the chaos in the room. As they lifted Jed onto the stretcher, his eyes, wild with pain and fear, found hers. "Clara," he gasped, one word, a desperate plea for her to stay, for her to defy the dark thing that followed her. She rode with him in the ambulance, speeding down County Road 7, the siren a mournful cry in the night, watching the man she loved slip further away with every mile. The curse felt like a physical presence, sitting right next to her in the cramped space. At the hospital, the sterile brightness was a cold mockery of the home they had built. Jed was stabilized, but he was barely clinging to the edge. He was heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness. Clara couldn't leave. She pulled up a chair and refused to move, the picture of weary devotion. When Jed finally opened his eyes, they were dull and slow, but they fixed on her instantly. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak, rattling sound. She leaned close, tears blurring her vision. "Shh, darling," she whispered, stroking his hair. "It's all right. I'm right here. I'm not leaving." In that moment, watching him suffer, the internal conflict, the one between the fearful woman and the loving woman, snapped. The curse, she realized, was a lie. The only curse was her own isolation. If he died, he died. But he would die loved, and she would grieve with the memory of their brief, intense spring. She wouldn't let the shadow dictate her actions anymore. She was an angel on this road, not because she saved him, but because she chose to love him in the face of his end. The hospital became their monastery, a place of quiet, profound ritual. Clara rarely left his side. When Jed was lucid, they would talk about the future, not their future, but her future. He made her promise she wouldn't retreat back into herself, that she would find a small cabin by a quiet lake and fill it with blue things and the scent of honeysuckle. "You gotta live for two, Clara Bell," he told her, his voice stronger now, tinged with a final, desperate wisdom. "You live for the joy we found, not the sadness of the ending. The ending's just a closing door. The memory, that's the house you live in." His words were a gift, releasing her from the obligation of eternal mourning. He was giving her permission to be happy, to survive, to defy the curse by simply moving on without carrying its weight. It was the most selfless act of love she had ever known, a final, tender act of protection. He was teaching her how to love without holding on so tight that the inevitable separation tore her apart. His lucidity was a sign, Doc Eli confirmed, the final flare of the wick before the candle goes out. Jed knew it and Clara knew it. He asked to go home. He wanted to see the porch one last time, to feel the heat and hear the familiar, grating chorus of the cicadas. They brought him back to County Road 7, and the old house seemed to welcome him back with a quiet sigh. Clara settled him in his own bed, adjusted the curtains to let in the golden, late afternoon light, and sat beside him. He wasn't talking much now, just holding her hand, his eyes tracking the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. There was an immense peace in the room, a quiet completion. The suspense was gone, replaced by a profound, aching beauty. The conflict was over. Love had won by accepting its own finite nature. They had reached the summit, and now they were simply watching the sunset together. Every breath he took was a blessing, every heartbeat a victory against the swift finality of the disease. Clara started reading him his favorite poem again, the one about the quiet stream and the everlasting willow tree. She read it slowly, her voice soft as velvet. Halfway through the third stanza, Jed squeezed her hand, a final, gentle pressure that conveyed everything. She paused, looking down at his face. His eyes were closed, his breathing was shallow, and a look of deep, settled peace had replaced the lines of pain and worry. She waited, listening to the silence that was louder than any word. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked on, relentless and indifferent. She held her breath until she couldn't anymore, and then she slowly, carefully, felt for his pulse. It wasn't there. She knew, the moment she looked at his face, that he had slipped away, not in pain or fear, but in her arms, hearing the words he loved. The finality was a physical blow, but it was cushioned by the knowledge that their love was pure, short, and complete. The shadow had come, but it had taken only the shell. The heart, the memory, the truth, remained with her. She sat there for a long time, the sun sinking lower, bathing the room in an orange glow. She didn't cry yet. The tears were locked behind a stunned dam of acceptance. She felt the emptiness, the vast, echoing space where his spirit had been, but she also felt the surprising lightness. She was still here. The curse hadn't destroyed her. It hadn't taken her life or sanity. It had taken a man who was already taken by time, and in doing so, it had proved its own powerlessness against true love. A dying man had found love with a woman who feared love, and in their final synergy, they had both been saved. Jed from dying alone, and Clara from living alone. She finally stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtains shut, drawing the simple line between night and day, life and death. The air was cool now, finally. The heat of the conflict was gone. The funeral was small, simple, and honest, just the way Jed would have liked it. May was there, tearful but apologetic, humbled by the depth of Clara's grief and devotion. The townspeople, who had whispered about the curse, now murmured about the beautiful care that Angel Clara Bell had provided. The narrative had shifted. The curse was no longer the story. The love was. Clara stood by the grave, dry-eyed, wearing the blue dress Jed had once said matched her eyes. She felt the heavy gaze of the town, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for the next calamity to prove their gossip right. But she held her head high. She had paid her dues in fear. She wouldn't pay them in false modesty now. She was a survivor, strengthened by a love that faced death and refused to blink. She had one final thing to do, a promise she had made to the man in the ground. She stayed in the house for 2 more weeks, cleaning, airing the linens, giving the place the final dignity it deserved. She took down the heavy curtains, let the light stream in, and packed only a small box of personal things. Among them was the tattered poetry book, a faded, blue-checkered handkerchief that had been Jed's, and a single, dried clover flower. She sold the house back to May for a fair price, promising the cousin she would keep up the porch swing. On her last morning on County Road 7, she walked out to the porch, sat in the swing, and listened to the peaceful sounds of the morning. It was sticky and hot, but somehow bearable. She closed her eyes and saw Jed's smile. Not the sick, faint one, but the genuine, strong one from his happier stories. She felt him, not as a ghost, but as a warmth in her chest, a sturdy root. The shadow was gone. It had nowhere left to hide. Clara packed her blue Ford one last time. She didn't drive 3 counties over. She drove south, past the small towns and the dusty roads, until she found the kind of place she and Jed had dreamed of. A small, quiet cabin, tucked away beside a clear, unnamed lake, surrounded by whispering pines. It was simple, rustic, and needed a lot of work. The door was painted a cheerful robin's egg blue. The moment she stepped inside, she felt a profound sense of peace. There were no ghosts here, only potential. She unloaded her few belongings, set the poetry book on the small wooden table, and hung the checkered handkerchief over the window frame like a banner. She was ready to begin her life, a life built not on the anticipation of loss, but on the foundation of love that had already been lost, mourned, and transformed into strength. She was finally free to be the angel she was meant to be, not a bringer of death, but a vessel of fierce, protective life. She spent the first month repairing the cabin. She chopped wood, learned to fish in the lake, and spent her evenings reading by the firelight, the words of the poem she read to Jed echoing softly in her mind. It was hard, physical work, but it was also a cleansing. Every swing of the hammer, every scrub of the floorboards, was an act of letting go of the fear and embracing the present. She wrote a long letter to May, telling her she was happy, and that the cabin was all she had ever wanted. She described the lake, the way the light hit the water at dusk, and the deep, contented silence. She told May that Jed was right, that the memory was truly the house she was living in now, a grand, beautiful house with sturdy walls and an open door. She never mentioned the curse, not once. It felt like an old, forgotten name, stripped of all its power. She learned to talk to herself without the cold, cynical voice of fear. "You are safe, Clara Bell," she would whisper as she drifted off to sleep. "You are loved and you are ready." One day, while working in the small, overgrown garden, she found a patch of wild clover. It wasn't the exact same kind Tommy Ray had brought her, but it was close enough. She felt a brief, gentle ache, a touch of melancholy that was sweet, not sharp. She didn't run from it. She knelt down and appreciated its small, delicate beauty. It was a testament to all the loves she had known, the youthful, the lost, and the final, profound one. She picked one, pressed it into the pages of Jed's poetry book, and smiled. The old pattern was broken. Joy no longer guaranteed ruin. It simply was. She was learning that grief was just the tax you paid on a good life, and she considered the tax she paid on Jed's love to be the fairest deal she'd ever made. She was 30 years old, and she was finally, truly, in charge of her own story. The quiet of the woods wasn't a place to hide. It was a place to grow. The days turned into months, and the autumn arrived, painting the trees in brilliant, defiant colors. Clara began to feel an itch, the need to serve again. Not out of penance, but out of a genuine desire to give the love she had learned to receive. She volunteered at the nearest small-town clinic, a place far enough away that her history didn't matter, but close enough to matter to the people who needed her. She was a different nurse now. She still worked with competence, but she allowed herself to linger, to touch, to smile, to offer a true, heartfelt comfort. She wasn't afraid of attachment anymore. She knew that the risk of loss was simply the price of connection, and that the connection itself was the reward. She spoke softly, with a new rhythm in her voice, a gentle, down-home cadence she'd picked up from Jed and the Deep South. Her spirit was lighter than the dried tobacco dust of County Road 7. She was surprised one afternoon when a small, battered blue Ford pulled up the long gravel drive to her cabin. A man stepped out, tall and lanky, with a wide, friendly smile and a basket in his hand. He introduced himself as Jim, a local carpenter who had been hired to fix the roof on the old fishing shack down the road. He said he saw the blue door and the light shining from the windows and just had to stop by. He wasn't aggressive or pushy, just genuinely kind and a little shy. Clara felt a flutter in her stomach, a nervous, happy tremor she hadn't felt since she was that girl who loved Tommy Ray. She didn't run. She didn't invent excuses. She invited him in for a glass of sweet tea, her heart beating a steady, hopeful rhythm. She noticed that the cicadas, usually so loud, were quiet right then, but this time the silence felt like possibility, not dread. Jim stayed for an hour, talking about wood grain and fishing flies, and then he left, promising to bring her a fresh-caught catfish the next day. She didn't sleep well that night, filled with an anxious excitement she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "If this goes well, something bad will happen," the old voice threatened. "Then let it," the new voice replied, steady and calm. "I'll deal with it then. Today I'll have catfish." The next day, Jim arrived as promised, bringing not only the fish but a bunch of sunflowers he'd grown himself. They sat on the small porch she had built, shucking corn and talking easily. He asked about her past, and she told him the simple truth, that she had loved a dying man, that it had been short but beautiful, and that it had. One clear, cold evening, Jim proposed. He didn't have a fancy ring, just a simple band of silver he'd hammered himself. He knelt down in the pine needles, looked her straight in the eye, and asked her to share the quiet life with him. Clara didn't hesitate. She looked into his honest, open face, and for a split second, she thought of Tommy Ray, of Jed Stone, and of the shadow that had always threatened to steal her joy. Then she looked at the peaceful cabin, the clear lake, and the gentle strength of the man kneeling before her. She laughed, a free, unrestrained sound she hadn't known she was capable of. "Yes, Jim," she said, pulling him up and kissing him hard. "Yes, I will. No thunder, no lightning, no sudden illness. Just the profound, quiet confirmation that the curse was truly, finally, broken by the sheer, stubborn will to live and love fully." The shadow had shrunk back into the dark corners of the past. They decided to get married in the spring, when the wildflowers were blooming and the air was soft again. They planned a small, simple ceremony right by the lake, inviting only a few close friends and, of course, May. Clara wrote to May, telling her about Jim and the upcoming wedding, and May responded with a long, rambling letter of congratulations, enclosing a faded photograph of Jed on the front porch swing, smiling mischievously at the camera. Clara pinned the photo to her mirror, a quiet, loving witness to her new life. She had learned that true love wasn't about avoiding the pain of the end. It was about honoring the beauty of the middle. Jed's final, profound love had been a baptism, washing away the superstition and leaving behind a woman fiercely capable of happiness. The morning of the wedding was clear and bright. Clara wore a simple white dress and a wreath of wild daisies in her hair. As she walked down the short path to the lakeside, she felt a presence, a warmth in the air that was sweeter and lighter than a ghost. She knew Jed was there, a part of the air, a part of the water, a happy echo in the eternal rhythm of the South. Jim was waiting, his eyes shining with open, uncomplicated love. When they exchanged vows, they promised not just to cherish each other, but to cherish every single, beautiful day they were given, knowing full well the fragility of the promise. They kissed, and the small crowd applauded, the sound mingling with the gentle lap of the lake water against the shore. The angel on County Road 7 had traded the dusty road for the clear water, and she was home. She was still a nurse, but she was also a wife, a friend, and soon a mother. The years passed with a steady, peaceful grace. The cabin was filled with Clara and Jim grew old together, their hands wrinkled and familiar, their hearts full of the shared tapestry of a long, good life. They would often sit on their porch swing, watching the sunset over the lake, sharing a cup of coffee and a comfortable silence. One evening, Jim turned to her and said, "Clara, you told me once you were afraid of a shadow, a curse that followed you." Clara smiled, a deep, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "Oh, Jim," she chuckled. "That shadow? It wasn't the curse. That shadow was just my own fear, blocking the light. Jed taught me that the only real curse is the life you don't dare to live. And bless his heart, he made sure I couldn't run from my own." She took his hand, their fingers interlacing. The love they shared was quiet now, solid as old stone, warm as the Georgia sun. She finally understood that Jed's love wasn't a stop on the way to death. It was the final, perfect push she needed to take the first step toward her own bright, beautiful life. The angel on County Road 7, now just sweet, steady Clara, looked out over the still water. The setting sun cast a final golden gleam, illuminating the small, blue-painted cabin door. The legacy of Jed Stone wasn't a tragedy. It was the foundation of everything she had built, a love so pure it cleansed the past. She had found her peace, not by defeating the darkness, but by choosing to shine her own light, strong and unwavering, forever anchored in the memory of the dying man who showed her how to live.